And all right, perfect. It's recording now. So we have Nate Wardle here. He is the press secretary for the Pennsylvania Department of Health, and he is giving us our first talk of the semester for the virtual seminar series. He is also a graduate of the MSEM program and Millersville Meteorology. So without further ado, here is Nate.
Thank you very much, Amber. Realized I was still muted. Today is going to be a little bit of my diverse background. I started at Millersville in 2006 as an undergrad pursuing a degree in meteorology. And then I decided that I hadn't had enough at Millersville. And so in 2011, early 2011, I started the master's program, graduating in the summer of 2013 with my master's in emergency management. And then you're probably wondering how I ended up at the Department of Health through all that. We'll talk about all that as we move through the presentation. And if anybody has any questions throughout, just go ahead and stop me and let me know. And I will be more than happy to take them throughout the presentation. You don't have to wait until the end. So Millersville Meteorology, I was one of those people, I know a lot of people who go into the meteorology field know what they want to do very young. It was 2005 and I was still kind of uncertain what I wanted to go to college for. And then Hurricane Katrina happened and I spent most of the time watching the Weather Channel as a high school senior, and it really grabbed my interest and kind of set me on the path of becoming a broadcast meteorologist, which is what I knew I wanted to do with my meteorology degree. And so in 2010, I graduated from Millersville with a bachelor's degree in meteorology with a broadcast option. And I had a number of college experiences that not only helped confirm that that was what I wanted to do as far as becoming a broadcast meteorologist, but also kind of helped eventually push me to the path of the emergency management program. I went on 3 different mission trips with the University Christian Fellowship in Millersville. And through those experiences, the picture shown here is in New Orleans, actually in Plaquemines Parish, where Katrina made landfall. It's the fire station. And that trip was in the winter of 2007. So it would have been about a year and a half after Katrina. And you can still see how far away they were from rebuilding. We also saw refrigerators up in trees, and we're in an area on the southern tip of the peninsula there south of New Orleans that was completely devastated by Katrina. And so those experiences, I was in New Orleans twice on mission trips, and then another one to the California area that was affected by the Witch Creek fire. So those experiences really played a large part into my interest in emergency management. And I remember Dr. Yalda saying to me one of my last semesters, if you ever have an interest in going back to school, I think you'd be really great for the emergency management program. And at the time, I kind of brushed her off because it wasn't something I was considering. I thought for sure I was going to end up as a broadcast meteorologist and be on TV. But I think there were some other things at play, and eventually I took her advice. 2010, I graduated and I sent out probably hundreds of tapes because at that point you needed more than just a YouTube link to send to news directors. And so I sent all those tapes to numerous different TV stations. Didn't hear from very many of them. I had interned at CBS 21 in 2008, and so I knew Tom Russell, the chief meteorologist there, and Steve Knight, their morning meteorologist, who at the time was a traffic reporter when I interned. I knew them, and I knew that there might be some opportunities there, but I figured they wouldn't be on TV, considering Harrisburg's a fairly large market in the grand scheme of things for television. It's around 50 in about 180 some markets. So 2010, lots of job applications. I actually ended up spending most of my summer working as a lifeguard with about several different jobs, and then working in a warehouse because it was close to my house and made for an easy job. And then I decided maybe going back to school would be a good decision. So I applied to be a master's student at Millersville and got accepted, and that was very exciting. And of course, right at that same time, I also got a job at CBS 21 as the part-time receptionist and production assistant. So I was CBS 21 at the time hosted the lottery, and the lottery was drawn in their TV studio. And so somebody needed to be up front from 4 to 8 p.m. to let those people into the building and let them back out of the building. So that was the receptionist part of the job, and then also handling phone calls. The production assistant was I was doing web duties. So I was posting to social media, posting to websites, editing video, and doing those types of things. And of course, this was 2011, where a lot of that was still very new. But it got me into a newsroom and was a great experience for me. From there, I moved into a number of different positions at CBS 21. In November of 2011, I became a full-time employee as a web producer. And then in 2012, I moved to the assignment desk, starting out working evenings from 3 to 11, and eventually becoming the assignment manager during the day. I also filled in as a meteorologist numerous times while I was at CBS 21, and I was also a key member of the weather office. And by that, I mean the summer of 2011, my first year there, was very active as far as severe weather and tornadoes. And so it was frequently seen watching me run from the front of the building where the receptionist office is all the way to the back of the building where the TV studio is to help assist by running graphics for the chief meteorologist or whatever meteorologist was on staff regarding tornado warnings and assisting with that. The picture here is one of my opportunities on air as a fill-in meteorologist, and we'll talk a little bit more about those right here. So during the winter, the late fall, early winter of 2013-14, CBS 21 was without a weekend meteorologist due to a set of events that occurred. And so they needed people to fill in. And despite my permanent role on the assignment desk, I was one of the people who filled in, and I was hoping that it would become a full-time position for me where I would have the opportunity to be on air as a weekend meteorologist. And I found out shortly after Christmas, right around the end of 2013, going into 2014, that that wasn't going to be the case, that they were hiring someone else. And while that was extremely disappointing, I knew that I would have one last opportunity to be on air, and that was going to be February 1st and February 2nd. And I went into the Weather Center on the 1st, a Saturday, and I knew that the chief meteorologist, Tom Russell, had been calling for about an inch or two of snow, but nothing really major. And as soon as I sat down and started looking at forecasts and models and what some of the products that were out there, I quickly realized that the snowstorm was going to be more than just 1 to 2 inches. It was going to be a plowable snow for South Central Pennsylvania. And so I reached out to Tom and let him know my thoughts, and the news director as well. And they were both making sure that I didn't need anything, didn't need somebody to help assist me with the forecast. And I was like, no, guys, I got this. I'll be prepared and ready to go. And so the day before the storm occurred, which as you can see in the graphic there from New York City area weather, the storm mainly was on February 3rd. February 2nd, 2014 was Super Bowl Sunday. And what was interesting about that is with only 2 meteorologists on the staff at the time, one of those was morning meteorologist Steve Knight, who is a Denver Broncos fan. The other was chief meteorologist Tom Russell, who is a Seattle Seahawks fan. And if you are aware of who was playing in the Super Bowl that Sunday, it was those 2 teams. And so neither Tom or Steve really were overly interested in coming in and helping to assist, but Tom kind of had his arm twisted, and he came in and assisted in the 11 o'clock newscast. I handled the 10 o'clock on the CW on my own. And so at 11 o'clock, I got out and I was able to report from out in the field, talk about the conditions and how we hadn't seen any snow yet. The one thing I can say walking away from that, even though it was my last opportunity on air in the Harrisburg market, was that my forecast was spot on. I was calling for mainly 6 to 8 inches across most of the area, and as you can see from the map here, that is exactly what fell. So it was a exciting time for me. It was also a kind of frustrating time, but it helped shift my focus away from broadcast meteorology and weather as my future into some other options. So going back to the Masters of Science in Emergency Management, a program that many of you are familiar with, my first course was taught by Dwayne, and it was on terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and homeland security. And at the time, I wasn't really 100% sure what I had got myself into, and didn't know kind of how the entire program would go. But I was immediately hooked. As somebody who had done some research previously on 3 Mile Island, and obviously had lived through 9/11 and living in central Pennsylvania my entire life, many of these topics were ones that were relevant to me and very interesting as well. And then some of the other courses of the ones that I took during the master's program that really stuck out were the social dimensions of disaster, which is something that I deal with on a daily basis in my current position, as well as emergency mental health and trauma, and then also the emergency management planning, because I also have another role that goes into emergency management. I am the emergency management coordinator for Mechanicsburg Borough in Cumberland County, which means that I am helping to assist in any major emergencies, but also kind of acting as the coordinator between the fire chief, the police chief, and the fire and police agencies in the borough, as well as the EMS agency. And so in addition to that, I also have a few volunteer roles on the Cumberland County Local Emergency Planning Committee. In fact, we have a summit coming up next week with a lot of the facilities that have hazardous materials in Cumberland County that we will be sharing information with them, and I'll be presenting on disaster communications to them. Obviously, disaster communications was a very important course for me. It's something that I use on a daily basis, and something I had a decent understanding of going in as somebody who worked in television and was able to bring a different perspective to that. The last thing that was part of my emergency management degree was completing an internship. And I did that at the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. And there I was working with the communications director at the time was Corey Angel. And something that they really wanted to do was to create a social media profile. They had a Facebook page. It wasn't utilized in a strong way, I guess would be the best way to put it. And so they were really looking for somebody to determine how they could best use social media going forward. And so I created a social media plan for them, scanning through what many other states were doing. I looked at whether or not an app would be a good idea for the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. And so went through those items and developed those for the communications office at Pima. And the one other thing that I did that year was some storm research. At the time, Pima, this is 2013, they did not have a state meteorologist. So they knew of my weather background, and they used that to help me to kind of discuss where storms had occurred. I was looking at a lot of newspaper articles and also some weather maps to determine where damage was and whether Pima would be able to apply for federal funding to help recoup some of the loss that occurred from those storms. And so it was a very eye-opening experience. Just working in state government kind of gave me an introduction into that. And that's a very important part as to how I got to where I am now. So I'll talk about that a little bit. I had applied for a digital director position at Pima because I thought it was perfect for me since I had created their emergency management plan or their social media plan. Needless to say, I did not get that position, but Ruth Miller, who I had also worked with, she was the deputy communications director when I interned. She was the communications director at the time, and this was 2016. And she reached out to me and said, "Hey, I saw you're interested in our deputy director position for digital. Unfortunately, it looks like we're filling that, but I may have an opening with another agency. Would you be willing to work in health?" And I immediately replied that I would be, that health has always been something that interests me. I have a twin brother who's a physical therapist in Western Cumberland County. My wife is a nurse. She works at a hospital here in central Pennsylvania as well. And so I said, sure, I would be more than willing to work for the Department of Health. And so I had an interview, and that all went well, and was able to use my emergency management degree and also my social media background and planning that for Pima is something that's helped give me the upper edge in my interviewing process. And got the position in September of 2016 as the Emergency Preparedness Public Information Officer for the Pennsylvania Department of Health. And the position is one that's federally funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And so what you're working on is somewhat limited. You're working on emerging diseases. And so for the most part, at the time, it was Zika, it was monitoring Ebola, which was starting to come to an end. And then anything else that became an emerging disease. There was a whooping cough outbreak throughout South Central Pennsylvania, mainly in Franklin County, that occurred in 2016. And so my first opportunity on air as a PIO, you can see the screen grab here from ABC 27, was an opportunity to discuss whooping cough and the outbreak that was seen in the Chambersburg area with the TV station. We dealt with a couple other emerging diseases at the time, West Nile virus, Lyme disease, and then also anything that is disaster related also fell into my role. So the typical flooding and winter storms, and then working on exercises was one part of my role. Probably the biggest disaster that we dealt with while I was in the position as PIO was the train derailment that occurred in Hinman. And there's an interesting backstory to this. I was at Pima that day, and that's not a usual occurrence. Usually I was downtown at the Department of Health, or I was at the Bureau of Public Health Preparedness, which is where I split my duties. I was at one of those two offices, but on this day I was at Pima because I was helping to teach a basic public information officer course with Jeff Jumper, who is also a grad of the program, and Chris Post, who actually was my teacher for the PIO course. And so I was helping to teach a section on social media and writing news releases. And I had received the alert early in the morning that there was a train derailment. And so I thought this might be an interesting example. So I was pulling up some social media accounts of people who were following this train derailment in southern Bedford County, a very isolated area where cell service was rather spotty. And so I was monitoring it, and I finished talking about what I needed to as far as writing press releases and those types of things. And I decided I would go down and check and see if Pima needed anything from a communication standpoint. And Ruth Miller, the communications director, is like, yes, can you stay here? And I was like, sure, absolutely, anything you need. And so at that point, one of the Pittsburgh stations had just got their news chopper over the area, and video similar to this picture that came from a WTAE story was starting to surface, showing that this train derailment was not the 5 cars that were originally reported, but was much more serious than that. And so we spent time messaging that. This occurred on a Wednesday, and from a Department of Health aspect, everybody was evacuated from the area because of the fumes from the cars that were on fire and some of the potential chemicals. And there was also a pretty severe threat there could be an explosion. Luckily, that didn't happen, but the messaging from our standpoint was when it was safe for people to go back in. And so on Friday, myself and my boss, our director of communications with the Department of Health, April Hutchison, we ended up going to Hinman for a discussion with CSX, the railroad company who was in charge of the response, and also it was their train that was involved in the accident, as far as when people should be let in and what was safe as far as from a Department of Health standpoint. Probably the most as far as disasters that I did while I was in the PIO position was related to exercises. And I can't stress that enough because so often we talk about real world events, whether it's a hurricane or a tornado outbreak or something less expected like a train derailment, but your exercises are what prepare you for that. And I took part in several weather exercises, but also several nuclear power plant exercises. And they were opportunities to really test our communications plan and make sure that we were prepared for any type of disaster from the Department of Health standpoint. Starting late 2017, I started kind of acting as the press secretary with the Department of Health. It wasn't until February of this year that I was actually promoted to the position. And as press secretary, I deal a lot with the media, obviously, with different press requests. In fact, right now we have several different fairly major topics going on, one being acute flaccid myelitis, which is something that you may have heard of. It's a disease that causes polio-like symptoms in mainly children. And we've been messaging that. We put out a press release on it yesterday. And then also salmonella, there's about 100 salmonella cases across the United States. And of course, the majority of them, more than any other state, are in Pennsylvania. So I've been dealing with the press regarding that. That's a large part of what I do, is handle press requests. And those can range from anything to medical marijuana, and which obviously is a large initiative of the Department of Health and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a whole, but also the opioid crisis has been another part of that, with the incident commander, Ray Bereshansky, being from the Department of Health. Our organization has been on the lead and in the forefront of communicating with that crisis, and we've also spent a lot of time communicating about any number of other topics in reference to health. Flu obviously was a very big one this year, and we're hoping that people could get their flu vaccines, and we've been messaging for that. So a lot of what I do is sharing information, whether that's with other state agencies, whether that's with the public, whether that's with the media. We have our messages that we're trying to get out. The other important part is communication. And as somebody who worked in TV, we often lamented that working in communications, we often were the worst at communications. And so that's kind of the meaning of the picture here. You don't want to have what you're supposed to be good at be your biggest pitfall, but often it can be, because either you assume that something's occurring and maybe it's not, or you don't necessarily have that open line of communication. And that's so important, whether you're in a field working in emergency management, whether you're like me working as a communicator, whatever that may be, you have such a responsibility to ensure that you are providing information to people that they can understand. And for us, in communicating with the public, that's obviously important, because we are trying to make sure that people get the information they need in a way that they can understand. And for us, that's communicating at a level that's approximately a 6th to 8th grade level. And so we want to make sure that the information we're sharing is not overly technical, but is information that people can act on. Studies show that that's the biggest thing that people want during a crisis, and whether that crisis is related to a hurricane like Hurricane Michael, as we've seen, or Hurricane Florence this year, or whether it's related to something like a flu outbreak like we saw earlier this year in Pennsylvania and across the entire country. People want action steps of what they can take. And so our biggest communication for the flu, of course, the main action step is to get your flu vaccine, but there's any number of other steps that people should take as well. As far as staying home, washing their hands frequently, and just practicing proper hygiene. Some of the key issues, I mentioned some of these already, that we've dealt with the Department of Health, have been the opioid crisis, medical marijuana, the flu, and Lyme disease. Each of those kind of speak for themselves, and they each carry their own inherent challenges. With the opioid crisis, a lot of it we've been trying to reduce the stigma. The opioid crisis it's a disease. Having opioid use disorder is a disease, and so we've been messaging that and making sure that people are aware that many of the people who are addicted to opioids, it's not a lifestyle choice or anything like that. These are people who have a neurological disease and that they need help from it. Medical marijuana, of course, we've been working to build up the program in the department, and the medical marijuana staff within the Department of Health have done a fantastic job of that. But it comes with our own challenges as far as messaging and requests from the media, especially as the topic of legalization becomes something that's even more prevalent in Pennsylvania than it was even earlier this year. The flu I've already talked about, and then Lyme disease. Lyme disease, Pennsylvania has a higher number of cases than any other state. And so there's been a lot of work to make sure that people are aware of what Lyme disease is, how it can be transmitted from ticks to people, and efforts to make sure that people are aware of how they can work to prevent that. So I think I'm on my last slide here and willing to take any questions, but I think it's just really important to show that this field of emergency management and the master's degree really opens you up to so many different areas. I've met different people and know, of course, different people who were in my graduating class who work at a range of different positions, whether it's private industry, whether it's the public sector working for local government, state government, or the federal government. And there's just so many opportunities for so many people. And I think it's encouraging that emergency management, it's going to continue to grow. The field is one that's been growing for years now, and I don't think that's going to stop when you look at topics such as active shootings in various locations, when you look at topics such as the concerns over the spread of diseases. Emergency management covers all of that, and there's so many opportunities for people to work in ways that really can help not only their local communities, but help make changes that will help keep everybody safe moving forward. For me, it's been a very rewarding career path. I never would have expected, even once I started the emergency management program, I never would have expected I'd be working in the Department of Health, but it's been fascinating to watch as I've got here from working in TV, but it's also been a very enjoyable experience. I think that the degree is one that obviously Millersville's program is second to none, and I think that people who go through the program really have opportunities to do pretty much anything that they want moving forward. So with that, I'm open to take any questions that anybody may have kind of about my experiences, how I got to where I am, or anything else. And then I also have my contact information here, my personal email, my Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me in any of those areas regarding anything that you either have a question about or are looking for information on.
MrCooper.com. Call 1-800-619-1899. Thank you. Thanks so much. Now for my latest hit.
All right, I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was wondering how you would suggest maybe, because I'm also in a position where like I'm not really sure what emergency management, like what my emergency management career looks like.
Mhm.
And, you know, I'm just started my program. So how would you suggest like to move forward or kind of gain that information that you would need to make career decisions?
Well, I certainly think that Millersville offers a wide variety of courses that allows you to kind of pick some of the electives that you want in the master's program. And as you take those, you will definitely see some of the things that interest you and areas that you may want to work in moving forward. The other thing is it's also important to remember, and I'm sure some of the other people who are on the webinar can attest to this, it's a very different job climate nowadays where you don't necessarily have to do something for 30 years. Where as you enter the field, once you graduate and have kind of your plan as to what you want to do, that may change dramatically from even one year to the next. And so I think just having an open mind and knowing what you want to do to start will give you the opportunity to kind of get into the field wherever kind of your interests lie and go from there. And you also have the opportunity, especially if you're working as, say, an emergency management for a municipality or a county or a state level. Many places are looking for people who are going to build this into their own and kind of take it over and run with it. I know when I was in the preparedness public information officer position with the Department of Health, they kind of gave me the ability to build the position into what I wanted it to be and to kind of run with some of the things that I saw were really important and to emphasize those. And so sure, there were tasks that they gave me. They're like, you need to update the website, which wasn't an issue. And you need to update the risk communications plan because we've had people who aren't communicators doing it. And both of those were easy to do. But there were also some other efforts such as dealing with access and functional needs populations or vulnerable populations and making sure that information's reaching them and just providing resources on any number of things, which were really part of my interest as far as somebody who has a background in meteorology, but also the interest in nuclear disasters, etc. Just making sure that all that information was available on the Department of Health's website. And I was able to do that and without any hesitation. And so I think it's just a matter of once you find out kind of what your niche is within emergency management, you'll find a position that you'll be able to start out in, and then as you show your ability, you'll just be able to continue to move from there, and you'll further know what you want to do moving forward.
Cool. Thank you.
Um, with your job at the Department of Health?
What was that, Amber? I think the first part of the question got cut off.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. So I said, what's one of your favorite experiences as far as helping people or conveying, communicating some emergency management information when you've gone out on the field with the.
So I haven't had a lot of, I guess, field experience. The one where I was in Franklin County and Chambersburg communicating as far as the whooping cough outbreak was one, and then out at the train derailment were the kind of the two on locations experiences that I've had. And those have both been extremely important and influential, because being out actually at the location where people are either concerned about an illness spreading or concerned about the air that they're breathing, these people have very real concerns, and you can tell that the messaging that needs to be put out, it needs to be in a way that not only can they understand it, but in a way that understands what they're going through. One of the biggest parts of crisis communication is that people need to be allowed to be scared or fearful as to what they're experiencing. And neither of those issues were probably as large scale or as horrific as something you would see with like Hurricane Florence or Hurricane Michael and the devastation that they have caused from an emergency management perspective. But those people had their very own concerns and fears, and some of them wanted to be heard. Some of them wanted to know that you were supporting them through what they're dealing with. And so those on location opportunities really drive home how important it is to communicate in a way that people are going to understand clearly what they need to do. It also is influential in a way that it allows you to kind of reflect as to why the emergency management field is so essential, because there's always going to be people who are suffering. I know one of Dwayne's favorite lines is always that you're in the bad day business, and it's so true. There's people who are dealing with a very bad day for them, and whether that's a major accident and people with severe injuries, or whether that's a hurricane, tornado, or other natural disaster, or whether it's people dealing with a healthcare issue. These people are struggling in a very serious way. And so you have the opportunity to not only provide them with information that's going to help them take action, but you also have the opportunity to talk with them and kind of help make them know that somebody cares about them. And I think that's something that I gained through those opportunities to go on the mission trips, is that many people have dramatic, interesting, courageous stories. Some of the people that I talked to who stayed at home during Hurricane Katrina, these are people who they grew up, they had maybe four generations living in the same house, so there was no thought of leaving. And Katrina made landfall right where they lived. And so just giving people the opportunity to talk about what they experienced often helps them to feel better. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest takeaways that I've had through the entire emergency management realm of my life, is just the importance of allowing people the opportunity to discuss what they've gone through and how that impacts not only you, but also them.
Okay, thanks.
And I had another question for you. Do you think you would be where you are today without your meteorology background?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think it's possible, because I would have probably still had an internship at Pima. Dwayne had the connections and knew the people that he was able to help me get into that. And but the meteorology background certainly plays a role into everything I do. I still send emails to the executive staff for the Department of Health once a week with a forecast for the upcoming week, just so people know what's going on as far as the weather. And obviously that can change. My email 2 weeks ago on Monday morning had kind of my forecast for Michael, and I still missed on the severity and the intensity of the storm. And so I think that without the meteorology background, part of me would still not understand how to fully communicate with people. Obviously, somebody who went through the meteorology program at Millersville, and then also the broadcast option that I had, I understood the importance of communicating weather to people on a level that they can understand. You can talk about high pressure and low pressure and cold fronts and warm fronts all day, but if that's not going to help tell them what they need to wear, what they need to prepare for, when severe weather is coming, what they need to pay attention to, how much snow to expect, and what that could do to roads, that's the information that people need on a daily basis. And moving into my position now, it has helped me immensely to not really have to learn that, to already understand it.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Nate. That was a really great talk. And I personally learned a lot just hearing your background. So I appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time out today.
Thank you guys for having me.
All right. Have a great day.